In 1944, the most powerful empire the world had ever known signed its own death warrant, not on a battlefield, not in a peace treaty, but in a luxury hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. The British Empire sent its delegates to a conference in Bretton Woods, a conference that would decide what the global economy would look like after World War II. Britain arrived at that conference as a superpower, an empire that still painted the world map red, an empire whose navy controlled the seas, an empire whose currency had been the backbone of world trade for over 100 years. But when those delegates sat down at the negotiating table, they discovered something terrifying. They had no power left. None. The Americans controlled the agenda. The Americans wrote the rules, and the British could do nothing but sign. Because Britain was bankrupt, completely, utterly, humiliatingly bankrupt. They owed so much money to America that they had become a puppet state. Their empire was being held together by American loans. Their survival depended on American goodwill. That moment in Bretton Woods was not the beginning of Britain's fall. It was just the moment when everyone could finally see what had been true for decades. Britain had spent itself into irrelevance. And before you click away, before you think this is just another history lesson, let me tell you something that should terrify you. The mistakes that Britain made in the 1920s and 1930s, the economic decisions that turned them from the world's dominant superpower into a has-been nation, America is making those exact same mistakes right now. Not similar mistakes, the exact same ones. And if you want to see what is coming for America in the next few years, all you have to do is look at what happened to Britain between 1918 and 1956. So hit that subscribe button right now, because what I am about to show you will change how you see every news headline, every political promise, every economic report. This is the story they do not teach in schools. This is the pattern hiding in plain sight. Let me take you back to 1918. World War I has just ended. Britain technically won, but winning nearly destroyed them. The war cost Britain over £35 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum at the time. That is like spending $50 trillion today. Britain had to borrow from everyone. From America, from their own citizens, from banks around the world. Before the war, Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. Countries owed money to Britain. After the war, Britain owed money to everyone, especially to the United States. But here is where the story gets interesting, because despite being essentially bankrupt, despite owing staggering debts, Britain still had something incredibly valuable. They still had the reserve currency. When people around the world wanted to save money, they saved it in British pounds. When countries traded with each other, they used pounds. When you needed to buy oil, rubber, or wheat on the international market, you paid in pounds. This gave Britain an extraordinary advantage. Think about this. Imagine you could pay your bills by just printing your own money, and everyone would accept it as valuable. That is what having the reserve currency means. Britain could print pounds to pay off debts. They could run trade deficits year after year because the world needed their currency. They had essentially infinite credit because everyone believed the pound would always be valuable. Does this sound familiar? It should, because America has that exact same advantage right now. The dollar is the reserve currency. When countries trade with each other, they use dollars. When central banks store their savings, they store dollars. America can print money to pay its debts, and the world accepts it because they need dollars. But back to Britain. The smart move after World War I would have been obvious. They should have cut spending. They should have scaled back their empire. They should have focused on paying off their debts and rebuilding their economy. They should have accepted that the war had changed everything, that they were no longer the richest nation on earth, that America had surpassed them. But that is not what Britain did. Instead, they made a decision that historians now consider one of the greatest economic mistakes in history. In 1925, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man named Winston Churchill, decided to return Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. Let me explain what this means because it is crucial to understanding what went wrong. Before World War I, the British pound was backed by gold. You could theoretically trade your pounds for a fixed amount of gold. This system collapsed during the war because Britain printed so much money to fund the fighting. After the war, Churchill decided to return to the gold standard, to make the pound backed by gold again. But here is the insane part. He wanted to set the value of the pound at the same level it had been before the war. He wanted to pretend that the war had never happened. He wanted to pretend that Britain was still as wealthy, still as productive, still as powerful as it had been in 1914. The pound was worth far less than that in reality. Britain's economy had been devastated. They had sold off assets. They had accumulated debt. They had lost a generation of young men. But Churchill and the British establishment wanted the world to believe that nothing had changed. It was pure pride, pure ego, pure delusion, and it destroyed the British economy. To maintain this artificially high value of the pound, Britain had to keep interest rates extremely high. This made borrowing expensive for British businesses. It made British exports uncompetitive because they were too expensive for foreigners to buy. It strangled economic growth. Unemployment skyrocketed. British factories closed. British mines shut down. Meanwhile, in America, the economy was booming. American factories were producing more goods at lower prices. American companies were innovating and expanding. The wealth gap between America and Britain grew wider every single year. Now, here is the part that matters for you today. Britain had a choice in the 1920s. They could accept reality, accept that they were no longer the richest nation, accept that the pound should be worth less, accept that they needed to live within their means, or they could keep pretending, keep borrowing, keep spending, keep hoping that somehow their reputation alone would keep them afloat. They chose to pretend, and America is making the exact same choice right now. Let me show you the parallels because they are stunning. Britain in the 1920s was running persistent trade deficits. They were importing more than they were exporting. Every single year, more money was leaving Britain than was coming in. This was masked by the fact that Britain earned income from investments abroad, from colonies, from financial services. But the underlying economy was bleeding. America has been running trade deficits every single year since 1975. 50 years of buying more from the world than we sell to the world. 50 years of consuming more than we produce. This has been masked by the fact that America earns income from investments abroad, from technology services, from the dollar being the reserve currency. But the underlying economy is bleeding. Britain in the 1920s was spending enormous amounts on military and empire. They had troops stationed across Africa, Asia, the Middle East. They were maintaining a massive navy. They were fighting small wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and India. All of this cost money they did not have. America today spends over $800 billion per year on the military. We have troops in over 80 countries. We maintain bases around the world. We are fighting ongoing operations in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. All of this is funded by borrowed money. Britain in the 1920s kept borrowing more and more to maintain their standard of living and their global position. Their debt kept growing, but because the pound was still the reserve currency, lenders kept giving them money at relatively low interest rates. Britain told itself that as long as they could borrow cheaply, everything was fine. America today has a national debt of over $35 trillion and growing. We add trillions to that debt every single year. But because the dollar is still the reserve currency, lenders keep giving us money at relatively low interest rates. America tells itself that as long as we can borrow cheaply, everything is fine. Do you see the pattern? It is not similar. It is identical. Britain told itself a comfortable story. They said, "We have been the dominant power for over a century. The pound has been the reserve currency for generations. Our reputation, our history, our empire will keep us strong. Yes, we have debt, but everyone has debt. Yes, we are spending more than we earn, but we are Britain. The rules do not apply to us." Then came the 1930s, and everything started to unravel. The Great Depression hit, and suddenly, countries around the world needed their money back. They wanted to convert their pounds into gold. They wanted to withdraw their deposits from British banks. And Britain realized they did not have enough gold to cover all the pounds they had printed. They had been bluffing. In September 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard entirely. The pound lost about 25% of its value almost immediately. Savings evaporated. The cost of imports shot up. Britain's reputation as a safe place to keep your money was shattered. But even after this disaster, Britain was not finished as a major power. They still had the empire. They still had colonies that were forced to use the pound, forced to keep their reserves in London, forced to buy British goods. This captive market kept Britain artificially propped up through the 1930s. Britain was living off the exploitation of India, Africa, and other colonies. It was not a sustainable system, but it bought them time. America has our own version of this. We do not have colonies, but we have something almost as powerful, the petrodollar system. In the 1970s, America made a deal with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations. They would sell their oil exclusively in dollars. This meant that any country that wanted to buy oil needed to hold dollars. It forced the entire world to use our currency. It created artificial demand for dollars. It let us keep printing money without immediate consequences. Just like Britain's colonial system, it is not sustainable forever. But it has bought us time. The real collapse for Britain came during and after World War II. Britain spent money they absolutely did not have fighting Nazi Germany. By 1945, Britain's debt had reached over 250% of their GDP. Imagine owing 2.5 times your annual income. That is where Britain was. They were bankrupt, completely insolvent. Their economy only functioned because of massive loans from America. And this is where it gets really important. America did not give Britain those loans out of kindness. America gave Britain loans because it gave America leverage. America could now tell Britain what to do. During the war, America forced Britain to start dismantling their trade preferences with the colonies. After the war, America forced Britain to make the pound convertible to dollars, which drained British reserves. America systematically took apart the British Empire's economic foundations, all while Britain was too weak and too dependent on American loans to resist. By 1956, when the Suez Crisis happened, Britain had become a middle power. They still had some military capability. They still had delusions of being a superpower. But economically, they were at America's mercy. When President Eisenhower told Britain to back down from Suez or face economic destruction, Britain had no choice. America could have collapsed the pound with a single policy decision. Britain surrendered in humiliation. That was the end. After Suez, everyone knew. Britain was not a superpower anymore. The pound was not the reserve currency anymore. The empire would be dismantled over the next 2 decades. Britain had fallen from the dominant power on Earth to a regional nation that had to ask permission before taking military action. The fall took about 40 years from start to finish, from 1918 to 1956, but the actual collapse, when everyone finally acknowledged reality, took less than 2 weeks during the Suez Crisis. That is how these things work. The decline is gradual, the collapse is sudden. Now let me tell you where America is in this timeline, and this is the part that should keep you awake at night. America's equivalent of World War I was probably the Vietnam War and the social spending of the 1960s. That is when we started running persistent budget deficits. That is when our debt started to grow faster than our economy. That is when we went off the gold standard in 1971 because we could not maintain the value of the dollar anymore. So, we are about 50 years into our decline. Britain's Suez moment came 38 years after World War I ended. If the timeline is similar, America's Suez moment is overdue. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen next year. It could be 2026. What will America's Suez moment look like? I do not know exactly, but I can tell you what the warning signs are. It will be a moment when America tries to exert its power, probably military power, and discovers that we no longer have the economic strength to back it up. Maybe we will get into a confrontation with China over Taiwan. Maybe we will try to enforce sanctions on a major country, and they will just ignore us because they have built alternative payment systems. Maybe we will have a debt ceiling crisis where Congress plays games with paying our bills and the world decides American Treasury bonds are not worth the risk anymore. Whatever the trigger is, the result will be the same. The world will suddenly realize that America is a debtor nation, that we owe more than we can ever repay, that the dollar is only valuable because of inertia and habit, not because America's economy justifies it. And when that realization hits, the decline will not be gradual anymore. It will be a collapse. Foreign governments will start selling their dollar reserves. The value of the dollar will drop. Everything we import, which is almost everything we consume, will become dramatically more expensive. Inflation will spike. Interest rates will soar. The government will have to choose between defaulting on the debt or printing so much money that the dollar becomes worthless. Either way, ordinary Americans will see their savings destroyed, their standard of living collapse, their country reduced to a shadow of what it once was. This is not speculation. This is not doom-mongering. This is exactly what happened to Britain. This is what happens to every reserve currency that falls. The process is well documented. The pattern is clear. And America is following that pattern step by step. Here is what makes it even worse. Britain at least had an excuse. They spent themselves into bankruptcy fighting 2 world wars against existential threats. They were trying to stop Germany from conquering Europe. You can argue that the spending was necessary even if it destroyed their economy. What is America's excuse? We are spending ourselves into bankruptcy on what? On endless wars in the Middle East that accomplish nothing. On a military budget bigger than the next 10 countries combined, most of whom are our allies. On a political system so dysfunctional that we cannot even pass a budget without threatening to default on our debt every few years, on tax cuts we cannot afford and spending programs we refuse to pay for. Britain destroyed their economy for survival. America is destroying our economy for nothing. Out of pure fiscal irresponsibility, out of the delusion that being American means the laws of economics do not apply to us. Every politician promises more spending and lower taxes. Every politician kicks the debt problem down the road. Every politician assumes that someone else will deal with the consequences. And the public is just as guilty. We demand services we are not willing to pay for. We want the lifestyle of a rich country while running up the bills of a poor one. We refuse to accept any sacrifice, any cut, any acknowledgement that we are living beyond our means. The numbers are absolutely terrifying if you look at them honestly. America's debt to GDP ratio is now over 120% and rising fast. We are adding at least $2 trillion to the debt every single year. The interest payments on that debt are now over $1 trillion per year. Think about that. We are spending more on interest payments than we spend on the entire defense budget. We are spending more just to service the debt than we spend on Medicaid. And it is going to get worse. As the debt grows, the interest payments grow. As interest payments grow, we have to borrow more. It is a death spiral. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2050, interest on the debt will consume 100% of all federal tax revenue. That means every single dollar the government collects in taxes will go just to pay interest, not to the military, not to Social Security, not to Medicare, not to anything, just interest on past borrowing. That is not a sustainable system. That is not a country that can remain a superpower. That is a country on the verge of collapse. But just like Britain in the 1920s, America is choosing to ignore the warnings. We are choosing to believe that our reputation will save us, that the dollar will remain the reserve currency forever just because it has been for the past 80 years, that the rest of the world will keep lending us money at low interest rates even as our debt spirals out of control. We are making the exact same bet that Britain made, and we are going to lose the exact same way. Let me tell you about some of the specific mechanisms of how this collapse will unfold, because understanding the mechanics is crucial. Right now, foreign governments hold about $7 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. China holds over $800 billion. Japan holds over $1 trillion. These countries are essentially lending money to America by buying our government debt. They do this because the dollar is the reserve currency, because they need dollars for international trade, because U.S. Treasuries have been considered the safest investment in the world. But that is changing. China has been slowly reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasuries for the past few years. They are diversifying into gold, into other currencies, into real assets. Other countries are following suit. They see the same numbers I just showed you. They know the math does not work. They know that lending money to a country with unsustainable debt is a losing proposition. So, they are preparing for a world where the dollar is not the reserve currency anymore. When enough countries make this decision, when the trickle of selling becomes a flood, the consequences will be immediate and severe. The U.S. government will have trouble finding buyers for new Treasury bonds. Interest rates will have to rise dramatically to attract lenders. This will make the debt problem exponentially worse because we will be paying higher interest on an already massive debt. The value of the dollar will fall because fewer people want to hold dollars. This will make imports more expensive. Since America imports almost everything, this means inflation. The Federal Reserve will face an impossible choice. They can raise interest rates to defend the dollar, but that will crash the economy and make the debt unsustainable. Or they can print money to buy government bonds themselves, but that will cause even worse inflation and destroy confidence in the dollar. There is no good option. This is exactly the trap that Britain found itself in during the 1930s and 1940s. Once you have accumulated too much debt, once you have lost the confidence of your creditors, there is no painless way out. The only thing propping up the system right now is inertia. The world is used to using dollars. The financial infrastructure is built around dollars. Changing to a new system is complicated and expensive. So countries keep using dollars even though they know the system is unsustainable. But inertia only lasts until the moment it does not, until some crisis or some event breaks the pattern and everyone rushes for the exits at once. This is what happened to Britain in 1931 when they were forced off the gold standard. Everyone tried to convert their pounds to gold at the same time, and the system collapsed. This is what happened in 2008 with mortgage-backed securities. Everyone believed they were safe until suddenly everyone realized they were not, and the market collapsed in a matter of days. The same thing is coming for the dollar. Some event, some crisis will break the inertia. Maybe it will be a US default. Maybe it will be China invading Taiwan and America being unable to respond. Maybe it will be BRICS countries launching a new currency for international trade. Maybe it will be something nobody is predicting right now. But when it happens, the collapse will be swift. Countries will dump their dollar reserves. The value of the dollar will plummet. Inflation will explode. And America will experience what Britain experienced in the 1940s and 1950s, a sudden, undeniable, humiliating loss of status. My best guess, and this is just a guess, is that America's Suez moment will come sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe 2026 like some analysts are predicting, maybe 2030, maybe sooner. The exact date does not matter. What matters is that it is coming and that most Americans are completely unprepared for it. So what do you do? How do you protect yourself? First, understand that the government is not going to save you. When the crisis comes, the government will do what is politically expedient, not what is best for you. They will likely respond to a dollar crisis by printing more money, which will destroy savings. They might implement capital controls to prevent money from leaving the country. They might seize assets. They might do all sorts of things that seem unthinkable right now, but that governments throughout history have done when facing financial collapse. Your first line of defense is diversification. Do not keep all your wealth in dollar-denominated assets. Consider holding some assets in other currencies. Consider holding gold or silver as a hedge against currency devaluation. Consider real skills that will remain valuable even if the financial system breaks down. The people who survived Britain's decline were the ones who had diversified, who had not put all their faith in the pound, who had prepared for a different kind of future. Second, get out of debt as much as possible. When a currency collapses, debtors do benefit in one sense because they repay loans with devalued currency, but that only helps if you can still earn an income and still access credit. In a real crisis, credit freezes, jobs disappear. Having debt in that environment is dangerous. The safest position is to owe as little as possible. Third, build resilience. This means having savings that can survive a financial shock. This means having skills that are valuable in any economy. This means having a network of people you trust. This means being able to adapt when the rules change suddenly. Fourth, pay attention. Watch the warning signs. When you see foreign countries reducing their dollar holdings, that is a sign. When you see major economies signing agreements to trade in currencies other than the dollar, that is a sign. When you see U.S. Treasury auctions where there are not enough buyers, that is a sign. When you see interest rates on government debt spiking despite Federal Reserve intervention, that is a sign. Do not wait for the mainstream media to tell you the crisis is here. By the time it is obvious to everyone, it will be too late to prepare. Fifth, understand that this is not about politics. This is not about left versus right. This is not about Democrats versus Republicans. Both parties have contributed to this problem. Both parties are committed to policies that make it worse. Both parties will blame the other when the crisis hits. Do not get distracted by the partisan fighting. Keep your eye on the underlying economic reality. History is screaming at us. The pattern is right in front of our faces. Britain fell from superpower to irrelevance in one generation because of these mistakes, and we are making the exact same mistakes. The only question is whether we will wake up in time, whether enough Americans will understand what is happening and demand change before it is too late, whether we will choose to accept reality and make the necessary sacrifices now, or whether we will keep pretending until reality forces itself upon us in the most painful way possible. I know what my bet is. I have studied enough history to know that empires do not reform themselves. They do not accept decline gracefully. They do not make hard choices until those choices are forced upon them. They keep spending, keep borrowing, keep denying until the moment of collapse. Then they blame everyone but themselves. America will be no different. We will keep doing what we are doing until we cannot anymore, until the world stops accepting our currency, until our creditors demand payment, until we face our own Suez moment and discover that we are no longer the power we thought we were. And on that day, when the carefully constructed illusions finally shatter, most Americans will be shocked. They will ask how this could have happened. They will demand to know why nobody warned them. But the warnings were always there. The pattern was always visible. We just chose not to look. That is the real lesson of Britain's fall. It was not inevitable. It was not unstoppable. It was a choice. A series of choices made by leaders who cared more about the next election than the next generation. A series of choices made by a public that wanted comfort more than truth. A series of choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but that led inexorably to disaster. America is making those same choices right now, and the disaster is coming.